This is the second part of our lesson on section 6.2. Last section we learned about medians. In this section we learned about altitudes and perpendicular bisectors. Here's an observation. In some triangles, that perpendicular bisector, that would be this segment, this is a perpendicular bisector because this is a midpoint and this is a right angle. And the altitude, this is also an altitude because that's a vertex and this is a right angle. Sometimes those two segments are the same segment. If the perpendicular bisector of a side contains the opposite vertex, then the perpendicular bisector is also an altitude. Well, let's look at this again. What else can you call that segment YE? It touches a midpoint and it touches the opposite vertex. What do you call those segments? That would be a median. So we have three things going on. It could touch a vertex. It could touch a midpoint. It could have a right angle. If it does all three of those things, then it's a perpendicular bisector, it's an altitude, and it's a median, all at the same time. Now, if it does any two of those, then it's going to be one of those things. So this chart shows the similarities and differences of medians, altitudes, and perpendicular bisectors. To be a median, it's got to touch a vertex and it's got to touch a midpoint. Is it allowed to have a right angle? Sure, but it doesn't need to. Altitudes must touch a vertex and have a right angle. They're allowed to touch a midpoint, but they don't need to. Perpendicular bisectors must touch a right angle and touch a midpoint. Are they allowed to touch a vertex? Sure, but they don't need to. This is what the assignment is going to look like from this section. They're going to give you a triangle with a highlighted segment, and you have to decide, is that red segment a median, an altitude, or a perpendicular bisector? Okay, and this first one, the red segment touches a vertex, and it also touches this point down here, and this point is a midpoint because these are the same. What touches a vertex and a midpoint? That's a median. This segment touches a vertex and has a right angle on the other side of it. So it's perpendicular to this opposite side. That's an altitude. This segment touches a midpoint and has a right angle. That's what a perpendicular bisector looks like. So these first three examples were great examples of what each of these are, and it's only that thing. Now, some of these other ones might be more than one of these things. For example, we touch a vertex, we touch a midpoint, and we have a right angle. This is actually all three types of segments. Remember, when that perpendicular bisector touches a vertex, it's also a median and an altitude. This segment touches a vertex and has a right angle on the other side. That's an altitude. That's a midpoint because of those marks. That's a vertex. That's a median. Midpoint, right angle. That's a perpendicular bisector. That's a vertex. That looks like a midpoint, but it's not marked as a midpoint. It also looks like a right angle, but it's not marked as a right angle. That's just a segment. That's not a median, an altitude, or a perpendicular bisector. Same thing with this guy. Even though that's a right angle, that's not a midpoint, and that's not a vertex. So that's neither of these as well.